History's greatest financial misconception begins in a textbook. You open the page. The first paragraph tells you this. Humans began with barter. Wheat for meat, cloth for tools. Then the system grew clumsy, inefficient, and collapsed. At that point, someone had a brilliant idea. Money. Coins appeared. Trade became easier. Civilization moved forward. This story is clean, logical, satisfying, and almost entirely wrong. Because archaeologists, anthropologists, and economic historians have been saying the same thing for decades. There is not a single piece of concrete evidence that widespread, systematic barter economies existed among large human trading communities. In the clay tablets of Sumer, in the temple records of Mesopotamia, in the administrative documents of Egypt, there is no barter. But there is debt. Abundant, meticulously recorded debt. Money was not invented to solve debt. Debt was used to bring money into existence. And that distinction changes everything that follows in financial history. The question must be asked, if the barter economy is a myth, how did people exchange value before money was invented? The answer is both simpler and more complex. In small communities, people didn't keep accounts. They gave because they belonged. When a neighbor's roof collapsed, the village helped. When the harvest was plentiful, it was shared. When someone fell ill, others worked their fields. These transactions never had to balance out exactly. Memory functioned as a ledger. Trust functioned as an accounting system. And this system worked flawlessly, as long as people knew one another. But scale changes everything. The village grew. It became a town. The town evolved into a city. And at that point, memory proved insufficient. Strangers arrived with different customs, no shared history as people who didn't know each other at all. Trust could no longer be sustained through face-to-face relationships. And into that void stepped not merchants as one might expect, but administrators and temple priests. Consider the great grain warehouses of Mesopotamia. In 3000 BC, the temple complexes of Sumer were not merely places of worship. They were the largest economic institutions in the region. They stored wheat. They distributed barley. They gave seed to landowners to be returned at harvest time, and they inscribed every one of these transactions onto clay tablets. The debtor's name, the amount received, the repayment date, interest. Yes, interest. Interest existed before money was invented. These tablets are humanity's earliest known financial records, and they contain no barter. They contain debt, standardized, recorded, and enforceable debt. So how did this debt system work? And more importantly, why did it emerge so early? The answer lies not in the logic of economics, but in the logic of power. To govern a large society, you need two things: to collect resources and to redistribute them. Taxation and expenditure. Today we do this through money, but before money was invented, temple and palace economies accomplished this through debt. A farmer would bring grain to the temple. That grain would be recorded as an obligation. Not the farmers, but the temples. The temple would then distribute that grain to others. The craftsman, the soldier, the irrigation worker, and that distribution would also be recorded as the recipient's debt to the temple. The economy was a web of interconnected obligations. Not money, but record keeping. Not metal coins, but liability. And the most critical feature of this system was this. It required a standard unit of measurement. How much was a bushel of barley worth? What was a day's labor valued at? How many bushels of wheat was a jug of olive oil? It was to answer these questions, to enable debt to be recorded accurately, that abstract units of value emerged. The Sumerian shekel was not originally a coin. It was an abstract unit corresponding to a specific weight. Silver existed, but not as a physical coin passing from hand to hand. As a benchmark used in records, debt created the measure. The measure made money possible. Why does reversing this sequence matter so much? Because the story of money came first. Debt followed imposes a particular worldview upon us. In that view, debt is a tool that appeared at some point while people were freely trading, useful, optional, fundamentally neutral. But the reality that debt came first says something very different. Debt is not a feature of the economy. It is its architecture. Markets did not arise from their own internal dynamics. They were constructed from the top down through grain warehouses and clay tablets. And the purpose of that construction was not trade. It was control and resource extraction. So why does this distinction still matter today? Because the roots of the modern monetary system lie in exactly the same place. Central banks don't print money. That is a metaphor. In reality, money is created through debt. When a bank extends you credit, it is not transferring an existing sum of money. In that moment, it is creating money that existed nowhere before, as a liability. And that money disappears when the debt is repaid. The vast majority of money circulating in the modern economy is nothing other than someone's debt. Sumer's clay tablets have become digital accounting records. But the structure is the same. But the story doesn't end there. Because debt was not merely an economic tool, it was also a political weapon. In the millennium following Sumer, we see the same cycle playing out across every major civilization. In times of famine or war, small farmers borrowed against their seeds, their tools, their land. When harvest failed, they couldn't repay. When they couldn't repay, they lost their land. And when they lost their land, farmers who had once been free became tenants. Tenants became bonded laborers. And bonded labor became, in all but name, slavery. This transformation became so systematic and widespread that by 2000 BC, Mesopotamian rulers were occasionally compelled to declare debt amnesties. The famous laws of Hammurabi are, in part, a codified record of these amnesties. The king would see a society being torn apart under the weight of debt and would reset it until the cycle began again. Debt forgiveness, a concept invented 2,000 years ago. Doesn't this cycle feel familiar? As great civilizations expanded, so did the scale of debt management. In ancient Greece, wealthy citizens lent to small farmers and seized their land when payments failed. In the 6th century BC, Athens came to the brink of this crisis. Solon's reforms were the release of this pressure before it exploded. Agricultural debts were canceled, enslaved citizens were freed, land boundaries were redrawn. But these reforms offered no permanent solution. The structure was unchanged, only the pressure had been relieved. The same cycle played out in Rome. The small farmer went to war. His land fell into neglect during those years of fighting. He fell into debt, and he lost his fields. Large landowners acquired the vast estates known as latifundia through precisely this mechanism. Rome's agricultural middle class was liquidated over centuries through the machinery of debt. And that liquidation was one of the silent preconditions for the empire's long decline. The army weakened. Tax revenues fell. The system contracted. Debt was not merely an individual burden. It was a civilization's structural vulnerability. By the time we reach medieval Europe, the picture had changed, but only on the surface. The church had imposed a prohibition on usury. Lending money at interest was a sin. This prohibition is presented in many history books as evidence that finance regressed during the Middle Ages. But what actually happened was far more interesting. The prohibition did not eliminate debt. It transformed it. Italian merchant families, the Florentines above all, found exquisitely elegant ways to render interest invisible. It was concealed as an exchange rate differential in contracts and thus written across two different currencies. It was processed as profit sharing within partnership agreements. Payment terms were manipulated, and the difference was invoiced as a risk premium. The church's prohibition on interest ultimately drafted the first blueprint of modern financial engineering. Constraint gave birth to innovation, and that innovation made debt more complex, more pervasive, and more systematic. The Medici family stood at the pinnacle of this system. Florence's most powerful banking dynasty managed papal funds, lent to the rulers of Europe, and financed art and architecture. The interest entries in their ledgers carried different names, but the numbers told the same truth. Debt was the most efficient instrument of power, and that instrument was no longer confined to temple records. It was present in every corner of the continent. So what does all this history tell us today? When we look at the birth of modern central banking, at the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, we find a striking continuity with the temple economies of Sumer. England needed money to cover its war expenses. Bankers lent to the royal treasury. In return, the state granted those bankers the authority to issue banknotes. These banknotes were paper instruments backed by the state's debt. And people accepted these pieces of paper because they trusted that real value stood behind them. State debt created money. Money made more debt possible. And that cycle is still turning today. When the Federal Reserve creates money in the United States, it is actually purchasing an asset, typically a government bond. In other words, the state issues a debt instrument. The central bank purchases it, and in exchange, money enters the system. Money is the other face of debt. Understanding this mechanism allows you to see the modern economy through an entirely different lens. Why does inflation arise? Because debt expands and the money supply grows in parallel. Why are interest rates so critical? Because they determine the cost of debt, and the cost of debt determines the cost of everything in the system. Why is deflation considered so dangerous? Because debt gains real value in deflation. And that crushes debtors. The dynamics of debt are the dynamics of money. The two are not separate, and it is here that the most unsettling lesson of all this history comes to the surface. Debt is not a neutral tool. It never was. In Sumer, land flowed through debt. In Athens, freedom flowed through debt. In Rome, power flowed through debt. In medieval Europe, dynasties were shaped by debt. In the modern world, the balance of power among states, corporations, and individuals is fed by debt. Debt functions like a pump, moving value upward, from bottom to top, from debtor to creditor, from those who own labor to those who own capital. This process occurs on its own in the absence of regulation, because the logic of debt rewards the concentration of capital. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a mechanism, and you don't need to look far to see this mechanism at work. Look at the combined total of household debt, corporate debt, and public debt worldwide. These figures have long since surpassed global GDP, which means humanity, collectively, has promised to pay back more than it is capable of producing. Since Sumer's clay tablets, the answer to this question has not changed. Either debt will be forgiven, or default will occur, or new money will be created to dilute value. The options are the same, only the scale has grown. History is not a verdict. It is a mirror. Debt is humanity's oldest and most powerful financial instrument. It built civilizations. It fed armies. It raised cathedrals. It financed the Industrial Revolution, and at the same time, it destroyed villages, toppled empires, and left generations burdened with obligations they never chose. The tool operates independently of intention. Debt behaves as it was designed to. It moves value across time and space. In whose favor it moves, that value is always a question of power. Understanding this does not change your borrowing decisions. Credit is not evil. Interest is not immoral. But seeing the system as it actually is, what incentives it is built upon, whom it rewards, whom it weighs down, is the beginning of genuine financial literacy. Because those who do not understand the system cannot even recognize that they are inside it. 5,000 years have passed since the scribe who inscribed that first clay tablet in Sumer. The tablet has changed. The logic has not. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.